The Last Test, a revision by H.P. Lovecraft of Adolphe de Castro's A Sacrifice to Science. Chapter 1. Few persons know the inside of the Clarendon story, or even that there is an inside not reached by the newspapers. It was a San Francisco sensation in the days before the fire, both because of the panic and menace that kept it company, and because of its close linkage with the governor of the state. Governor Dalton, it will be recalled, was Clarendon's best friend, and later married his sister. Neither Dalton nor Mrs. Dalton would ever discuss the painful affair, but somehow the facts have leaked out to a limited circle. But for that, and for the years which have given a sort of vagueness and impersonality to the actors, one would still pause before probing into secrets so strictly guarded at the time. The appointment of Dr. Alfred Clarendon as medical director of San Quentin Penitentiary in 1890 was greeted with the keenest enthusiasm throughout California. San Francisco had at last the honor of harboring one of the greatest biologists and physicians of the period, and solid pathological leaders from all over the world might be expected to flock thither to study his methods, profit by his advice and researches, and learn how to cope with their own local problems. California, almost overnight, would become a center of medical scholarship with earth-wide influence and reputation. Governor Dalton, anxious to spread the news in its fullest significance, saw to it that the press carried ample and dignified accounts of his new appointee. Pictures of Dr. Clarendon and his new home near Old Goat Hill, sketches of his career and manifold honors, and popular accounts of his salient scientific discoveries were all presented in the principal California dailies, till the public soon felt a sort of reflected pride in the man whose studies of pyemia in India, and of the pest in China, and of every sort of kindred disorder elsewhere, would soon enrich the world of medicine with an antitoxin of revolutionary importance, a basic antitoxin combating the whole febrile principle at its very source, and ensuring the ultimate conquest and extirpation of fever in all its diverse forms. Back of the appointment stretched an extended and not wholly unromantic history of early friendship, long separation, and dramatically renewed acquaintance. James Dalton and the Clarendon family had been friends in New York 10 years before, friends and more than friends, since the doctor's only sister, Georgina, was the sweetheart of Dalton's youth, while the doctor himself had been his closest associate and almost his protege in the days of school and college. The father of Alfred and Georgina, a Wall Street pirate of the ruthless elder breed, had known Dalton's father well, so well, indeed, that he had finally stripped him of all he possessed in a memorable afternoon's fight on the stock exchange. Dalton Sr., hopeless of recuperation and wishing to give his one adored child the benefit of his insurance, had promptly blown out his brains. But James had not sought to retaliate. It was, as he viewed it, all in the game, and wished no harm to the father of the girl he meant to marry and of the budding young scientist whose admirer and protector he had been throughout their years of fellowship and study. Instead, he turned to the law, established himself in a small way, and in due course of time asked Old Clarendon for Georgina's hand. Old Clarendon had refused very firmly and loudly, vowing that no pauper and upstart lawyer was fit to be his son-in-law, and a scene of considerable violence had occurred. James, telling the wrinkled freebooter at last what he ought to have been told long before, had left the house and the city in a high temper, and was embarked within a month upon the California life which was to lead him to the governorship through many a fight with ring and politician. His farewells to Alfred and Georgina had been brief, and he had never known the aftermath of that scene in the Clarendon library. Only by a day did he miss the news of old Clarendon's death from apoplexy, and by so missing it changed the course of his whole career. He had not written Georgina in the decade that followed, knowing her loyalty to her father, and waiting till his own fortune and position might remove all obstacles to the match. Nor had he sent any word to Alfred, whose calm indifference in the face of affection and hero-worship had always savored of conscious destiny and the self-sufficiency of genius. Secure in the ties of a constancy rare even then, he had worked and risen with thoughts only of the future, still a bachelor, and with a perfect intuitive faith that Georgina also was waiting. In this faith Dalton was not deceived. Wondering perhaps why no message ever came, Georgina found no romance save in her dreams and expectations, and in the course of time became busy with the new responsibilities brought on by her brother's rise to greatness. Alfred's growth had not belied the promise of his youth, and the slim boy had darted quietly up the steps of science with a speed and permanence almost dizzying to contemplate. Lean and aesthetic, with steel-rimmed pince-nez and pointed brown beard, Dr. Alfred Clarendon was an authority at 25 and an international figure at 30. Careless of worldly affairs with the negligence of genius, he depended vastly on the care and management of his sister, and was secretly thankful that her memories of James had kept her from other and more tangible alliances. Georgina conducted the business and household of the great bacteriologist, and was proud of his strides toward the conquest of fever. She bore patiently with his eccentricities, calmed his occasional bursts of fanaticism, and healed those breaches with his friends which now and then resulted from his unconcealed scorn of anything less than a single-minded devotion to pure truth and its progress. Clarendon was undeniably irritating at times to ordinary folk, for he never tired of depreciating the service of the individual as contrasted with the service of mankind as a whole, and in censuring men of learning who mingled domestic life or outside interests with their pursuit of abstract science. His enemies called him a bore, but his admirers, pausing before the white heat of ecstasy into which he would work himself, became almost ashamed of ever having any standards or aspirations outside the one divine sphere of unalloyed knowledge. The doctor's travels were extensive, and Georgina generally accompanied him on the shorter ones. 3 times, however, he had taken long, lone jaunts to strange and distant places in his studies of exotic fevers and half-fabulous plagues, for he knew that it is out of the unknown lands of cryptic and immemorial Asia that most of the earth's diseases spring. On each of these occasions he had brought back curious mementos which added to the eccentricity of his home, not least among which was the needlessly large staff of Tibetan servants picked up somewhere in Yuzhang during an epidemic of which the world never heard, but amidst which Clarendon had discovered and isolated the germ of black fever. These men, taller than most Tibetans, and clearly belonging to a stock but little investigated in the outside world, were of a skeletonic leanness which made one wonder whether the doctor had sought to symbolize in them the anatomical models of his college years. Their aspect, in the loose black silk robes of Bonpa priests which he chose to give them, was grotesque in the highest degree, and there was an unsmiling silence and stiffness in their motions which enhanced their air of fantasy and gave Georgina a queer, odd feeling of having stumbled into the pages of Vathek or the Arabian Nights. But queerest of all was the general factotum, or clinic man, whom Clarendon addressed as Sarama, and whom he had brought back with him after a long stay in northern Africa, during which he had studied certain odd, intermittent fevers among the mysterious Saharan Tuaregs, whose descent from the primal race of lost Atlantis is an old archaeological rumor. Surama, a man of great intelligence and seemingly inexhaustible erudition, was as morbidly lean as the Tibetan servants, with swarthy, parchment-like skin drawn so tightly over his bald pate and hairless face that every line of the skull stood out in ghastly prominence. This death's head effect being heightened by lustrelessly burning black eyes set with a depth which left to common visibility only a pair of dark, vacant sockets. Unlike the ideal subordinate, he seemed, despite his impassive features, to spend no effort in concealing such emotions as he possessed. Instead, he carried about an insidious atmosphere of irony or amusement, accompanied at certain moments by a deep guttural chuckle like that of a giant turtle which had just torn to pieces some furry animal and is ambling away toward the sea. His race appeared to be Caucasian, but could not be classified more closely than that. Some of Clarendon's friends thought he looked like a high-caste Hindu, notwithstanding his accentless speech, while many agreed with Georgina, who disliked him, when she gave her opinion that a pharaoh's mummy, if miraculously brought to life, would form a very apt twin for this sardonic skeleton. Dalton, absorbed in his uphill political battles and isolated from Eastern interests through the peculiar self-sufficiency of the Old West, had not followed the meteoric rise of his former comrade. Clarendon had actually heard nothing of one so far outside his chosen world of science as the governor. Being of independent and even of abundant means, the Clarendons had for many years stuck to their old Manhattan mansion in East 19th Street, whose ghosts must have looked sorely askance at the bizarrerie of Surama and the Tibetans. Then, through the doctor's wish to transfer his base of medical observation, the great change had suddenly come, and they had crossed the continent to take up a secluded life in San Francisco, buying the gloomy old Bannister place near Goat Hill, overlooking the bay, and establishing their strange household in a rambling, French-roofed relic of mid-Victorian design and gold rush parvenu display, set amidst high-walled grounds in a region still half suburban. Dr. Clarendon, though better satisfied than in New York, still felt cramped for lack of opportunities to apply and test his pathological theories. Unworldly as he was, he had never thought of using his reputation as an influence to gain public appointment, though more and more he realized that only the medical directorship of a government or a charitable institution, a prison, almshouse, or hospital, would give him a field of sufficient width to complete his researches and make his discoveries of the greatest use to humanity and science at large. Then he had run into James Dalton by sheer accident one afternoon in Market Street as the governor was swinging out of the Royal Hotel. Georgina had been with him, and an almost instant recognition had heightened the drama of the reunion. Mutual ignorance of one another's progress had bred long explanation and histories, and Clarendon was pleased to find that he had so important an official for a friend. Dalton and Georgina exchanged many a glance, felt more than a trace of their youthful tenderness, and a friendship was then and there revived, which led to frequent calls and a fuller and fuller exchange of confidences. James Dalton learned of his old protégé's need for political appointment, and sought, true to his protective role of school and college days, to devise some means of giving little Alf the needed position and scope. He had, it is true, wide appointive powers, but the legislature's constant attacks and encroachments forced him to exercise these with the utmost discretion. At length, however, scarcely 3 months after the sudden reunion, the foremost institutional medical office in the state fell vacant. Weighing all the elements with care, and conscious that his friend's achievements and reputation would justify the most substantial rewards, the governor felt at last able to act. Formalities were few, and on the 8th of November, 1890, Dr. Alfred Schuyler Clarendon became medical director of the California State Penitentiary at San Quentin.